my talk will really look, actually it will be a little bit data-driven, not too data-driven, looking at how we actually measure the AMR problem. And actually, when I say convergence of ideas, I'd like to come back to something that Ramanan said, and that is really, what are we trying to do in terms of output and impact? What are we trying to actually affect? And really, the basis of my talk is going to be around the fact that we should be putting the patient in the very centre of this whole issue of AMR resistance. And I'll talk you through what I mean about that. So, I'd like to start by looking at the AMR surveillance pathway. Now, you'll be familiar with this, but just to remind us, this contextualises what AMR surveillance is about. So it starts with a patient going to their doctor with a suspected infection, and one hopes that at that point there's an opportunity to take samples for diagnostic testing to determine the cause. Now, we know that a viral infection doesn't need antibiotics, and that a bacterial infection does. And that bacteria might be susceptible or resistant. Testing will allow us to understand that, modify the antibiotics given to the patient, and then we need to determine the outcome of that infection through clinical follow-up and accurate death certification. Now, if you look at this pathway, it can be divided into diagnostic and antibiotic stewardship, looking at using the right drug at the right time, right dose for the right duration, looking at patient outcome. We know that this should be feeding through to an evidence base to inform decision-making for patients and populations and policy change. And that is really focused around local use for patients and appropriate prescribing, national collation and global collation. Now, the striking thing is when we look at what we're doing at the moment, we are focused on the bacterium and not the patient. Now, this is where we are, and we have actually, I would consider this to be phase one of AMR surveillance, if you like. This is where we are at the moment. This is the data that we have. So I'd like to just review where we're up to with that. Now, we know that the WHO GLASS is making remarkable strides in analysing this sort of data. So starting with its global report in 2014, it went on to produce a manual for implementation of GLASS in 2015, and then the latest report is an early implementation report of their findings in 2018. Clearly, these are key players. But what I would say is that they're not the only player. And a really nice piece of work done by Liz Ashley looking at an analysis of surveillance networks in low and middle income countries reported that this is a very crowded environment. A very large amount of data is being produced. Now, these two graphics really kind of capture that. The bubble plot shows AMR and One Health networks in low and middle income countries since the year 2000. Now, focusing on the blue, which are the bacterial networks, if you then look across to the other side, you'll see the number of networks subcategorized by disease under surveillance over time. You'll see the networks are going up, the bacterial networks there again are in blue. An important aspect is that these networks come and go. So a median duration for these networks is just 6 years, usually often associated with fixed-term funding. So what this tells us is there's a lot of data there to be captured and analysed, which is exactly what Susie and her colleagues in IHME are busy doing at the moment. Now, Liz actually helped us think through, as part of a piece of work conducted by SEDRIC, which stands for Surveillance and Epidemiology, a Drug-Resistant Infections Consortium, which is supported by Wellcome, how we might harness the sources of antimicrobial resistance data to support surveillance in low-resource settings. So what we did was we took her previous review and we looked at where these networks actually sat. So in the sunburst chart, you'll see of 44 supranational networks, 21 of those were in pharma and 13 were in academia. So that does not include tuberculosis, by the way, that's non-tuberculosis bacteria. So in this review that we published in the Journal of Antimicrobial Chemotherapy, we felt that there were untapped sources of data from research and pharma which could provide a short-term solution to bridge the gap between now and the time when routine surveillance capacity has been established through initiatives such as the Fleming Fund and others. Now, at this point, the Wellcome funded a project through the Open Data Institute to understand whether it was possible to unlock the pharma data. And to cut a long story short, after 6 months of work there's been a great success in understanding where pharma data sits, and there's now a data reuse prize based on information from the Pfizer Atlas program, which is open now, and so the competition will really look at innovation in how we analyse and reuse data, which I think is very exciting. But I come back to this idea of impact and outcome. The current paradigm of bacterial-focused surveillance is actually like putting the cart before the horse. It has no direct patient benefit, and the data being retrospective, it doesn't have the same potential impact on public health as it could do. So what I would suggest is that we really need to start to focus much more on moving from the bacterial aspects of surveillance to patient-focused surveillance. Not an easy thing to do. So I would propose that what we need to be doing is looking at the patient pathway and saying that we will collect data on the patient with their suspected infection, on the samples taken and the results of those samples for diagnostic testing, on the drugs used, the resistance and the modification of drugs given, and really critically, whether the patient survived or died. And again, this is a thing that's come through repeatedly today. Now, we at the SEDRIC did a roundtable event, and we got together a group of microbiologists, people that are working in LMICs, to think about patient-focused surveillance. And again, you'll see what's on this slide is echoed previously. The gaps and barriers are that not enough people are being cultured when they come in with sepsis, so blood cultures are often done very late in their diagnostic pathway, if at all. Again, this point that was made earlier, that clinicians are not incentivized to take samples and may not trust the results. So AMR surveillance is a hard sell to clinicians, and coming back to Rowan's point about culture and belief, we need to work with clinicians to help them understand why it's critical to get those samples into the microbiology laboratory by feeding them back the results that actually makes a difference to their patients. We don't have standardized protocols across the world, and we don't have data on patient outcome. Death certification are inaccurate often. So looking at the tools and enablers from this roundtable event, we agreed that strengthening engagement with clinicians is really critical. We need mechanisms to support low and middle income countries to adopt and use standardized methods. We need to develop technology to support laboratory standardization, such as apps or dashboards. There was a suggestion that we might have mobile microbiology units simply to provide a stopgap where no infrastructure exists. And finally, we need to utilize data generated by research labs in global surveillance. So, as part of a reaction to that, SEDRIC has developed a working group, which is led by Liz Ashley, which is looking at innovation around data collection and sharing. How do we innovate in this space? So we have 3 themes in that working group, which is going to be meeting for 6 months and will be reporting in the summer. First, what data should we collect with a patient-centric AMR surveillance program? What's the minimum data set that we can have? Second, how do we innovate in data capture? What could be used in LMICs readily to be able to capture the data, and then innovate in data sharing? Now, in terms of what success might look like, or progress at least, one of the areas that increasingly investigators are thinking about is trying to have a holistic approach to and a clinically orientated approach to surveillance. And this is just one example of several, which is called ACORM. So a clinically orientated antimicrobial resistance surveillance network, which is across South and East Asia. And what this is really looking at is trying to put everything together about the patients, the pathogens, the clinical syndromes, the outcome, and then try to harmonise it. And actually what this is really about is technical development, not necessarily the surveillance rollout itself, but how do we get that technology development in so that we can do this better? So my last slide is really thinking about international standards for data collection, collation and sharing. Now, I'm not aware of any international standards that we could all use, that we all recognise. And I think that there is a need for us to get together to have a single voice about what data we should be collecting and providing the tools to make that straightforward. So I'd like to acknowledge in particular the SEDRIC board. You can see the members there, other SEDRIC members that have assisted in the work that we're doing together with the Wellcome Trust Drug Resistant Infection Programme. Thank you very much.